Letter 9. On Creolization. We owe the Martiniquois poet Édouard Glissant forays, indeed, excursions, into political terrain. The man who supported Castro and Castroism developed the concept of Creolization. A certain Jean-Luc Mélenchon recently referred to it. Let us wager that the neo-Robespierrist read closely the poet's writings in which this concept is activated before becoming its fervent advocate. That, at the very least, is the minimum one could hope for. Glissant was a disciple of the Deleuze and Guattari tandem from A Thousand Plateaus, subtitled Capitalism and Schizophrenia, 1980. That promises poetic sophistication, but the imagination rarely blends well with a societal project, which requires less reverie and poetry than realism and pragmatism. In Introduction to a Poetics of Diversity, Glissant states that the world is becoming creolized, meaning that the cultures of the world, now brought into contact in a sudden and utterly conscious way, are being changed through their exchange, via irrevocable clashes, merciless wars, but also advances in awareness and hope that make it possible to say, without being utopian, or rather, by accepting to be, that today's humanities are slowly abandoning something they long clung to, the belief that an individual's identity is only valid and recognizable if it is exclusive of the identity of all other possible beings. And it is this painful transformation of human thought that I wish to think through with you. Irrevocable clashes, merciless wars, painful transformations, but also bolts of lightning and hard-fought renunciations. One could hardly announce it more clearly. Even for Glissant, Creolization is traumatic. Yet he desires it, wants it, hopes for it, works toward it, invites submission to it while claiming it is inevitable. He proposes nothing less than a conversion of being, in other words, a change in paradigm. To say it more clearly, a revolution to abolish the localized Judeo-Christian civilization and replace it with a globalized, creolized one. The Judeo-Christian civilization is, of course, white, colonizing, oppressive, oriented toward the one. Its geographical cradle is the Mediterranean Sea, which is closed, concentrating, enclosing, and serves as the genealogical crucible of monotheism that forges and consecrates the triumph of the one. In contrast, the creolized, mixed, hybrid civilization is modeled after the Caribbean Sea, a sea naturally open to transit, passage, encounter, confusion, exchange. One sees the idea clearly. Yet another Western variation on the theme of good and evil, black and white, true and false, a white thought. Glissant, who praises Creole, as if it were a single language when in fact there are almost as many Creoles as there are countries where it is spoken, nonetheless writes all his books in French. Glissant borrows from Deleuze the opposition, also very Western and therefore very white, between the root and the rhizome. Judeo-Christian civilization is rooted. Creole civilization is rhizomatic. The former implies filiation, atavism, origin, lineage, and of course a claim to universality that despises and crushes all that is not itself. It leads to massacre and genocide, a naturally white invention built upon founding myths. The latter is composite, diverse, refracted, multiple, devoid of center, and based on myths of elucidation. In other words, a variation on the theme of the evil whites and the good Creoles, the kind Indians and the bad cowboys. The single root is the one that kills around it, whereas the rhizome is the root that spreads out to meet other roots. It is clear, Judeo-Christian civilization is murderous and genocidal, whereas Creole civilization is idyllic, an eternal variation on the myth of the noble savage. We see that Glissant contrasts two civilizations, deeming one detestable, the white and Western one, and the other admirable, the Creole and Caribbean one. It is therefore hard to take him seriously when he writes. Creolization assumes that the cultural elements brought into contact must necessarily be equivalent in value for creolization to truly take place. That is to say, if among the cultural elements in relation, Some are devalued compared to others. Creolization does not truly occur. It happens, but in a bastardized and unjust mode. For Glissant's creolization does not render the Judeo-Christian element brought into relation in equal in value to the Caribbean element. The former, Judeo-Christian, is in fact associated with racism, colonialism, war, genocide, whereas the latter, Caribbean, is placed alongside a paradise free from any negativity. This ideological proposition silences the history of Ham, born in the East, read and reread Genesis. The slave trade initiated by the Arab Muslims as early as the 7th century, which caused the deaths of millions of Africans. The multitude of African tribal wars over the centuries, long before the arrival of whites. Or, more recently, the Rwandan genocide. Not to mention racism, which in Martinique, still today and at this very hour, does not simply oppose blacks and whites, which would be simple and binary like Western thought, but skin tones and the many ways of being black. Negers, Chabin, Negandang, Singmalay, Lepo Sauve, Capre, Chape Kuli, an intracommunal racism that Glissant, of course, relates to remnants of colonialism, a good century and a half after its abolition. If people of color are racist, it is because whites colonized them. Édouard Glissant's biographer, François Noodleman, recounts a strange scene in which the author of the treatise of the whole world illustrates his theory of creolization with a curious allegory. In Italy, the poet is swimming in the Mediterranean Sea and is stung by a venomous jellyfish. To a child who asks him about it, he explains the geography of jellyfish, beings that float from the surface to the abyss, without any homeland, unattached and unrelated, drifting among the currents of all seas, devoid of any identifiable origin. Jellyfish herald another world, where center and periphery will vanish, giving way to the most fluid of circulations. It may seem strange, very strange even, that the jellyfish, known for the toxicity of its venom, which can be fatal in the case of box jellyfish, for instance, should serve as a metaphor for the creolization of the world. How can one desire, propose, and work toward a jellyfish-like future? Glissant does not want métissage, but creolization, because creolization is unpredictable, whereas the effects of métissage can be calculated. In other words, he desires creolization without knowing what it will produce, while insisting that we must desire and love what we do not know and which will inevitably come. Yet even as he claims ignorance of what will result, he already celebrates what is to come. Let us add to this that, knowing nothing of what is to come, he nevertheless states, there may be creolizations without violence. It seems to me there may be creolizations without violence. Yet I search for examples and find none. The man defended a state thesis in philosophy at the Sorbonne, and logically he should conclude that what is impossible to observe in reality, namely the absence of violence in the creolization process, does not exist, and conversely, that which constantly shows itself, violence in the creolization process, does exist and perhaps is the only thing that does. But we are not in the realm of logic. Glissant thinks as a poet, he claims it, which authorizes him to a poetics of chaos. However, when a poetic intuition underpins a political program with planetary civilizational ambitions, one can epistemologically demand more than reverie, imagination, or utopia, which causes havoc when those who claim to try to localize what, by definition, claims to have no place and remains placeless no matter what one does. It is rare for a utopia not to turn out murderous. One may well have the ambition not to live like a jellyfish in a world of jellyfish. A civilization made of venomous gelatin without brains? No, thank you. It is regrettable that someone who writes so clearly in his treaty of the whole world, our narratives are melopias, treaties of joyous speech, and maps of geography, and pleasant prophecies, which care not to be verified, is taken seriously. For others besides him, though aided and supported by him too, have taken these theses seriously and made them less a pleasant melopea than an ideological and political program. Now, Prophecies that do not claim to be verified form less the basis of poetic thought than of sectarian thought, which demands to be believed at face value regardless of feasibility. A sentence such as, "Believe me, because I say so," especially if it's unverifiable, because it must remain unverifiable to work, belongs to the register of the incanatory and performative, evangelical and parousiac. In any case, unreasonable. Likewise, to assert that creolization will be inevitable, that it may occur without violence, yet that there is no historical example showing that it has ever occurred without violence, since history instead shows that creolization always occurs with violence, is a strange way of thinking, or rather, of not thinking. Glissant considers Brazil a country where creolization has been successfully realized. Should this South American state be made a model, a show apartment of creolization? If one must disregard the violence, insecurity, misery, and poverty, prostitution, trafficking, the full powers granted to the mafia, drugs everywhere, justice nowhere, and the dead strewn in the streets from score settling day and night. If one must omit all that, then yes, long live creolization. But if we wish to deal with reality, then this famed creolization hardly seems the most enviable ideal. The same Glissant considers Japan the country most resistant to creolization. The proof? The bonsai. This age-old art is indeed one of the essential markers of a country which, along with ikebana, the Zen garden, sumo, origami, haiku, possesses an identity and has no aspiration to let itself be destroyed, consumed, and digested, creolized by the leviathan of globalism. Proof, if one were needed, that creolization entails the destruction of countries with strong identities in order to dissolve them in the acid of generalized miscegenation. The bonsai must not, apparently, offer ontological lessons to the Antilles. On the other hand, according to Glissant, the Japanese would have much to learn from the Antilles. The jellyfish versus the bonsai. Such is the civilizational alternative proposed by creolization. Creolization was thus verbally brought to the forefront by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who, while claiming to be a Republican, now believes that, since creolization has occurred on French territory, we must do away with the Republic in favor of a communitarianism that would lead to a sixth republic. This republic would bear only the name, resembling instead the democracy of the United States, which stands in stark contrast to the assimilationist principles of the French Republic. At the launch of his La Boétie Institute, Jean-Luc Mélenchon said, "Our people have creolized. The French people have begun a kind of creolization that is new in our history. We should not be afraid of it. It's a good thing," thus asserting that what is beginning should be welcomed, aided, and loved. Noting this creolization, the political leader, still campaigning more for himself than for France, claims that this Sixth Republic, the core of his presidential project, represents a vital need for the French nation. The former Lambertist Trotskyist praises a form of universalism that remains that of his youth, but it is not the same as that of the French Republic, which aimed to assimilate incoming populations into their host country in order to preserve the diversity of countries, peoples, and nations, the famous diverse of Ségolène, so dear to Glissant's heart, though he recycles the concept in a way that would have hardly suited the decidedly unprogressive author of the Immemorials. This disappearance of the Republic was clearly wished for by Édouard Glissant. In a debate he had for Philosophy magazine with Regis Debray, who defended the old-school Republic, the theorist of the Treaty of the Whole World stated, "The Republican ideal of fraternity, the idea of a universal homeland, of a chosen nation, are aspirations from a time when the world was not yet a world. Republican assimilation? All of that makes no sense anymore once the world is no longer a set of nation-states that juxtapose and paradoxically tend toward the same object while being enemies. Today, the world has become inextricable. No clear and efficient path can be discerned. And the ideal of fraternity in the era of globalization of the whole world can no longer be the Republican ideal. It requires métissage." What delight such a discourse brings to the advocates of happy globalization. The BHLs, Attlees, Minks, Soroses, and planetary capital. And we are surprised, well, not I, that the lighter Maximo of La France Insoumise might pour water into the mill of international capitalism, working toward the advent of a planetary government. Read or reread Who Will Govern the World Tomorrow by Jacques Attali for this globalized world, supposedly so easy to govern with a single iron hand, precisely requires that famous creolization, a concept that supports the useful idiots of capital. This creolization, as envisioned by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which entails the abolition and surpassing of the Fifth Republic in favor of the Sixth Republic, would undoubtedly give rise to a form of North American-style communitarianism, akin to that of the United States and Canada. Here again, once more, the USA, so hostile to old Europe, can only rejoice at such a prospect, one so close to its own. To work toward the creolization of a world is to contribute to its Americanization, and thus to the murder of Judeo-Christian Europe. In his exchange with Regis Debray, Édouard Glissant declares, "It is in métissage that fraternity can occur, not in Republican sublimation. The problem is that we have not yet found the new values that correspond to the ongoing creolization. We must find the values of a plural world, but in the meantime, not wait and just go for it. We'll see what happens." Such methodological nihilism is staggering. Here we find the inconsistency of one who knows what he is destroying while being ignorant of what he wants to build, and who even states that what will emerge after the destruction is not guaranteed. It is unpredictable, he says, even though violence always accompanies such a political project, which is also a civilizational project. How can one play so carelessly with such flammable liquids for the planet? Wouldn't such a fire risk setting ablaze cultures, peoples, countries, nations, and diversities, a blessing for those advocating a clean slate upon which to build the age of transhumanism? No matter if the blaze is beautiful. By claiming the status of poet, which would grant him ethical extraterritoriality where the artist is accountable to no one, Édouard Glissant is casting the dice on the future of the world. It is the Nero precedent, according to Suetonius. This is, of course, not reasonable. But since reason is a white invention, why take it seriously any longer? Let's throw reason overboard, says the poet who aspires to steer the latest version of the Titanic.